Hello, this is me getting in front of a camera after quite a while of not being in front of one, so apologies if parts of this video feel a little bit rusty. I feel a little bit rusty. And I wanted to chat a little bit about some of the books that I have read in the past couple months that I have really enjoyed and wanted to talk about and share. I also wanted to say hello. I have definitely missed making videos and definitely want to make that a priority again. If you're new here, hi, my name is Lillian. I really like to talk about books and writing and the art and craft of storytelling. And today, or rather tonight, I'm filming kind of late at night here, wanted to talk about some of the books that I have read recently in the past couple of months that I haven't gotten to talk about yet. Books that I have really enjoyed that I wanted to chit-chat about, do a little bit of a catch-up, and just say, hey, how y'all doing? I think I will have posted the first part of my Venice writing trip vlog before this video goes up, so if you're interested in watching that, I will link it up in the cards. I think it's on this side. Wow, it's been a while. I've forgotten what side the cards are on. But I will link it wherever the cards are, and I would love for you to go and check it out. It's probably the video that I'm most proud of having made thus far in my time on YouTube. But without further ado, let's get into the books. So the first book or books here that I wanted to talk about are from the Books of Bayern series by Shannon Hale. Earlier this year, I read the first book in the series, The Goose Girl, and have subsequently devoured the remaining 3 books in the series. Have really enjoyed this series. The first book in the series was published in 2003 and the series ended in 2009. So I actually listened to the audiobooks of this series and had a fantastic time with them. There was something about them that felt acutely nostalgic for me, even though I'd never listened to them before. I suppose just the overall vibe of the voice cast plus the music was just very nostalgic because it felt very early 2000s. The overall vibe of the books reminded me so much of a number of the books that I adored when I was about 11, 12, 13 years old, sort of just getting into like fantasy books and fairy tale retellings, which were my bread and butter at that age. So I would say if you were ever a fan of Gail Carson Levine's Ella Enchanted, any of Tamora Pierce's books, Juliet Marlier's Wildwood series, or Alison Croghan's The Books of Pellinor, I think that's a lesser known series, but I'm gonna throw that out there as well. This series felt very much in the same vein as those did, which was great for me because those were some of my absolute favorite books that I would constantly be rereading when I was around that age. Anyways, to give you a brief overview of the series without spoilers, we start off with the first book, The Goose Girl, which is a retelling of a fairy tale of that same name, which then sets the stage for the following books where we follow different main characters, but you have overlap of characters that you have seen before that have been the main narrators. I think there were a lot of factors in these books that, again, reminded me of books that I loved growing up. Like in those books, we have a group of mid to late teens discovering themselves and coming into their own as adults, as people, amidst a larger plot of fighting for what they believe in, standing up for what they think is right, and trying to do best by the community around them, doing their best to protect others and especially their friends, and trying their best to create a just and fair society for where they live. I really appreciate how these books, and often a lot of the books that I was a fan of in the early 2000s, felt like they really took young readers seriously. They didn't downplay or sort of coddle readers. They didn't shy away from difficult topics or attempt to dumb things down in any way. That being said, I will say that in this series in particular, there are definitely some darker themes, particularly in the second book in the series called Enna Burning. I would potentially look up some content warnings before diving into this series, but I will say I think there are some very adult topics handled and discussed and presented in these books, but I just feel like the darker themes are handled very well. They aren't dumbed down or softened for the target audience. I'll use the second book in the series that I mentioned, Enna Burning, just as an example. There's definitely a strong theme and discussion of the topic of war and PTSD, and the main character definitely goes through some things. And it just felt like throughout the series that Shannon Hale did a really fantastic job of handling these more difficult, sometimes complex issues and topics in a way that felt very appropriate for the age that she was writing for. The next book that I wanted to mention, I also listened to on audiobook, and that is Lavinia by Ursula K. Le Guin. This originally came out in 2008, and this book truly blew my socks off. I did listen to this on audiobook, but I definitely plan on getting a physical copy at some point and rereading and annotating the heck out of it. So this book is Le Guin's imagining of the life and perspective of Lavinia, the wife of Aeneas from Virgil's Aeneid. I know that Greek and Roman myth retellings have sort of gotten quite popular in the last several years, particularly ones that claim to have a feminist angle or lens to them. And while on the one hand, I feel like this is great in some regards, I think based on my own experience reading some of them, the execution hasn't necessarily been what I had hoped, in the sense of having an underlying understanding of the historical and social context that these characters would have existed in. What I will say about this particular retelling that Le Guin does with Lavinia, one of the reasons that I just adored it so much is that she really took the time and care to write Lavinia from a noticeably antiquated perspective. And what I mean by that is Lavinia is very much rooted in the perspectives, motivations, and expectations of the time that she would have lived in. You don't get the sense that she was translated for a modern audience, so to speak, for a modern reader to be able to understand and sympathize with, which I found very refreshing. Her character and her motivations feel very complete and true to the time that she would have existed if she was a real person, which overall I feel like led her to be a really interesting, nuanced, and fascinating narrator to listen to. The book is narrated from a self-conscious, self-reflecting first-person perspective, which I think can be really hard to do well in historical fiction, honestly, and in this case I think Le Guin knocked it out of the park. You can tell that she really did extensive historical research to write this book, and hence why she's able to write Lavinia's perspective so well, I think. Plus, I think Le Guin is just a fantastic writer and does character study really well as well. Lavinia honestly feels so real in this book, not only just as a possible historical figure that could have existed, but an actually fleshed out character from the epic poem itself, in which she's only mentioned in a few lines and doesn't actually have a line that she speaks. She's sort of spoken of. I feel like Le Guin knew enough of the historical social context, not only of what the character would have experienced, but also the world and perspective that Virgil was writing in at the time. She sort of knew that well enough to sort of play with certain aspects of the format of the poem, to play with and sort of poke at some of the aspects of the Aeneid itself. This was easily a 5-star read from me. I will be picking up a physical copy in the new year when my no-buy year is over. And the last book that I recently read and adored that I'll mention before I get into what I'm currently reading is A Caribbean Heiress in Paris by Adriana Hererra. This came out last year in 2022. I originally heard about this book and this author specifically on Grace's channel from Books and Cooks. She has a lot of really great romance recommendations. She tends to read more modern romance. Now, I've really been on the hunt since starting my romance reading journey to find a historical romance that I can really get down for. I love history, I love historical fiction, but truth be told, I've had kind of a rocky relationship with a lot of the historical romance that I have read. A lot of my issues stem from tired, outdated tropes, relationship flags that are passed off as quote-unquote passionate relationship indicators, and also for the most part a lack of honest historical knowledge and context. I know that there are definitely people that enjoy historical romance that really couldn't give a hoot as to whether or not it's historically accurate, but for me personally, someone who is very much a history nerd, it's just part of my brain that I can't shut off. So a lot of the historical romance that I have heard of or read myself has felt a lot more akin to historical fantasy than actual historical fiction or romance. It's often so far removed from any sort of actual historical context and usually brushes over most, if not all, of the more uncomfortable bits of history that exist, especially when it comes to things like the British monarchy and the aristocracy, as well as the super wealthy circles of American industrialists in the late 19th, early 20th century. However, A Caribbean Heiress in Paris let me have my cake. I need it too. for the most part. We'll get into it. Our main character, Ursula, is a distiller from the Dominican Republic who is setting sail in 1889 for Paris, specifically to attend the Paris exhibition that's being held in the city. She's carrying with her the legacy of many generations of female distillers. The news that in her recently deceased father's will, he made it impossible for her to access any sort of funds until she is married, and the pressure to find new buyers in Paris to take on orders for the rum that she makes in order to keep her business and her dreams alive. While in Paris, Ursula meets James Eveston Sinclair, Earl of Darnick, and shall we say, chaos ensues. I thought that the romance in this book was really well written, well paced, and certainly steamy. Evan and Ursula definitely had some really great couples banter back and forth. They're both very headstrong personalities and they do butt heads. I thought that Adriana Hererra did a really nice job of having them work through their conflicts, which were at sometimes explosive, but in the end they ended up being resolved in a meaningful way and in a healthy way. Definitely felt like Evan and Ursula were well matched, and I was definitely rooting for them. I also really appreciated that Hererra didn't shy away from having her characters discuss or be faced with the legacy of UK-based slavery and the sugar plantations in the Caribbean and how they were one of the main builders of aristocratic wealth in the 17th and 18th centuries. There were several meaningful scenes and plot points that dealt with the idea of racial privilege, when it's appropriate to step in and protect someone versus letting them fight their own battles and ensuring that their own voice is heard, when to let someone be heard versus speaking for them. I think that Adriana Hererra did a really great job of juggling some nuanced and sometimes heavy topics within a romance novel, but still having the novel itself be engaging and steamy. My one gripe with this book, and I promise I will try to be brief, because I know not everyone is a historical fashion nerd like I am, was the disdain for period corsets and undergarments. I know that most people have been brainwashed or bought into the fantasy that corsets were only ever this symbol of female oppression, and that modern women's undergarments are inherently superior and enlightened from what women were forced to wear in ye olden days. Now, I don't have time to unpack all of that in this video, but if you happen to be at all interested in this topic, I will leave some resources down below that I think are helpful in sort of breaking down this mythos. But there's a scene in this book where Ursula is praising a personal corset modification that essentially makes it no different than a modern bra. Maybe akin to like Regency era short stays, maybe. And I just the character's attitude is, oh, this is so much better, this is so much freer, and oh, this modification is so modern, it's so much smarter than anything women are doing in this day and age. And I just everything else in this book felt really well researched and contextualized for the time period that it was taking place in, from what I could tell. But there was that part and a few other minor historical fashion faux pas that did stick out like a sore thumb to me, but I think that just might be a me problem. I know it's not going to bother most people. It did bother me just a tiny bit, but overall it did not ruin the book for me by any means. I really enjoyed this book. I think it definitely takes the cake as the best historical romance that I have read in my experience so far. So I would highly recommend it if you are in the market for a fun historical romantic read. And then I will briefly mention some of the books that I'm currently reading because I'm really enjoying them at the moment. The first one being Dreaming in French, The Paris Years of Jacqueline Beauvoir Kennedy, Susan Sontag and Angela Davis by Alice Kaplan. This came out in 2006, but Kaplan is recounting the time that each of these eventually famous women, the time that they spent in Paris sort of as young women before they sort of reached any sort of fame in their life. Something that I've recently been really interested in looking at is how place plays such a heavy role in the creative process and the creative end product. I think that it's a context that is somewhat often overlooked. So I feel like this book is very much sort of within that vein, and I'm very interested to see how it plays out, and looking at how the city of Paris shaped the viewpoints of these women, how it shaped their sort of young adult experience and how it potentially had an impact on the rest of their lives. The next book is called Necessary Trouble, Growing Up at Mid-Century by Drew Gilpin Faust. This came out this past August 2023. Dr. Faust is an American Civil War historian that I really admire. So when I saw that she was publishing a memoir, I got really excited. I'm about halfway through the audiobook at the moment, which she herself narrates, and I'm really enjoying it. I love the way that she's not only recounting her own life, but her own family history within the context of what was happening at the time, the historical context, the sort of larger themes and motivations of society. Honestly, leave it to a historian to write a wonderfully structured and thoughtful, socially contextual memoir, which is just my cup of tea. The final book that I'll mention from my currently reading pile is The Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri. This came out in 2021. I've been reading it since this past summer, sort of slowly over time. It's a chunky book. I feel like this book was also making its rounds pretty heavily on BookTube about a year or two ago, so I won't reiterate a detailed summary because you probably already know what this book is about, but this is an epic fantasy book whose world and mythology are heavily based in the history and epics of India. We have a female bodyguard with a secret past that she's desperately trying to keep under wraps, and an exiled princess hell-bent on overthrowing her brother, the emperor. I'm not gonna lie, it has taken me a little bit to get into this book. It wasn't until I hit maybe like the 45% mark that I finally felt really engrossed and super engaged in the story. It could be that I just wasn't in an epic fantasy headspace when I started it. I feel like in the past few years I have sort of branched out from a lot of the fantasy books that I used to read. I still definitely enjoy them, but they aren't always my go-to. For whatever reason, current version of me has taken a little bit to get into this book, but now I'm in it and I'm definitely invested in things and characters and seeing how things play out. Things have definitely started to get politically juicy, shall we say, at the point where I'm at in the book. Definitely enjoying it. And that is that, my friends. I definitely need to wrap up this video because it's late. It's late. I'm tired and I feel like I'm just sort of rambling, not making sense at this point. But let me know what you have been reading in the comments below if you'd like. If you read any of the books that I mentioned, would love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this late night chit chat about some of the books that I've been reading recently, you can give this video a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more from me, you can subscribe. I'd love to have you. And I think with that, it's time for me to go to bed, folks. I hope you all are doing well, and I will see you in the next video.